Hello, and welcome to the Voices for Justice podcast, part of the Higher Endeavor Network's Equity and Racial Justice Learning Track. This podcast seeks to enhance equity-mindedness through conversations addressing critical topics and highlighting asset-based narratives from practitioners in the field. I'm your host, Alyssa Silva, and today we have a special episode where we'll get a chance to hear from our guest, Gabriela Torres, Deputy Director, Transformation at Scale on the Postsecondary Success Team at the Gates Foundation. She leads the team in working with partners across the country to understand, implement, learn from, and share evidence-based transformation that leads to success at scale. I'll now turn it over to Nia Haydel, Vice President for Institutional Transformation and Scaling at Complete College America, who will be facilitating our conversation today.
Thank you, Elisa. And welcome, Gabriela. I'm very excited for you to be our inaugural guest on our podcast. So, yes, thank you.
I'm
Very
excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
When we were, just to give a little bit of history, since this is our first podcast, when the ERJ, the Equity and Racial Justice Learning Track, was thinking about ways that we could really engage larger communities around the work that we're doing with the project, specifically with the Gates Foundation, but also in general, we thought, okay, let's have some conversations and around what's going on nationally on our campuses in the work that we do, and how do we really promote this type of, like, the theme of what we're doing to the broader community. And we wanted to invite you to be our first guest because this was started through the work that we're doing in Higher Endeavor with the Intermediaries for Scale project. So thank you very much for just like kicking us off. And if we could just get started by maybe you talking a little bit about the mission of the foundation's mission. Can you walk us through like the focus on racial justice and equity work even began, and if you see any kind of pivotal moments in where the work has been going?
Yeah, it's a great kind of setting the context question. And I think there's a couple layers that I can kind of quickly hit on that speak to how we got to some extent to where we are right here, right now. And so the first foremost is really looking at the Gates Foundation as a whole. So we are very clear in a core belief at the Gates Foundation that all lives have equal value. If you walk onto our campus in Seattle, it's one of the first things you see in big, bold letters when you're walking down the stairs into the campus. Just says up front, all lives have equal value. It seems like a simple sentence statement, but quite frankly, it manifests in very intentional and specific ways across all of our investing. And specifically within our post-secondary success team, what that means for us is that we know that we are committed to fighting the greatest of inequities, not just in post-secondary success, but in all of our strategies, because that is how I think the actualization of our belief comes to pass. And so for the post-secondary success team, our kind of North Star goal that no matter what investment that you might have with the Gates Foundation post-secondary success, it's going to be with a goal in mind around student outcomes and the quality of student experience are not predicted by race, ethnicity, wealth, or income. And so all of the investments that we do speak to that general outcome, and they get there in very different ways. But that is our North Star that guides all of our investing. And I think we really hope that the students' experience on campus, not just their outcomes, the graduation, the completion, the persistence, but their experience on campuses really speaks to the diverse perspectives of the students who comprise an institution. And that the lived experiences specifically of our focus student population. So that is really where some of your questions lies. We've defined our focus student population as Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and students from low-income backgrounds. So we've gotten very specific around who we're talking about when we say our focus student populations. And I'll just name one, to your point, pivotal moment that you're like, when did that come to pass? When did you decide to do that? The foundation, I think, prides itself on really trying to be a learning organization and on an organization that uses data to drive all of our decision making. And we had a number of investments in the post-secondary team 5, 10 years ago that were really speaking to college graduation completion are students in general graduating, and we're funding lots of stuff around institutional transformation towards that goal. And we found out that we were actually relatively successful. Like we invested in these institutions, really tried to learn about how they were transforming. And in many instances, their completion rates were increasing. And that felt like it was a success. It didn't feel like a success. It was a success, both for those institutions and for our investments. But when we looked more deeply at the data, we did recognize, and I think this is a recognition that came to a lot of people in the field, not just the Gates Foundation, not just philanthropy, is completion was increasing, but those equity gaps across some of those differences that I mentioned around race, ethnicity, income, and wealth either were not closing in the process. So everyone might have increased by 5% and the gap remained, or in some cases that actually the gap was increasing. So the completion increased overall, but those equity gaps actually got bigger. And we really took a step back and we're like, okay, something happened that we liked. Completion increased. Like that's a win. But also we didn't want the equity gaps to persist or to increase. And so we said, what do we need to do in order to ensure that that doesn't happen? We can keep building on the wins, keep increasing completion, but also getting more nuance with our approach. We had to name our specific focus student population so that our actions, and quite frankly, the data that we're looking at to drive our actions is way more precise. And so we might get into that in some of this conversation is similar to the broader field. I think disaggregated data is our friend, right? We're not just looking at an overall singular number of graduation. We're digging into the nuances because I think we believe that the complexities and nuances of the challenges that our institutions are facing, we need to develop solutions that are equally as complex. Not overly complex, let me be clear, but there is complexity to some of the things that we are trying to address. And if we are too simplistic or looking at things with too broad of a brush, it's not a surprise that we're not going to have the nuanced outcomes that we're trying to expect. So I hope that speaks a little bit to the foundation's priorities, PS priorities, and then a little bit of that pivotal moment and learning that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think you've brought up a lot of important things. One is I've experienced that the Gates Foundation is a learning organization, which is great because we do have complex problems and we have to be nimble in some as nimble as you can be in higher education, right? And so we have to be nimble in order to be able to meet the needs. So I think that's admirable and bold also to be able to say where we know that we need to really concentrate on this group. So I think that's remarkable. I also love the part you emphasized around lived experiences because oftentimes we can get lost in the fact that just because people belong to certain groups doesn't necessarily mean they have a lived experience
Yeah.
that really speaks to the population that we're trying to meet, and so how very important that is. So thank you for that. And when you think about the strategy that you lead specifically, what role do you believe equity-mindedness plays in related to student success and institutional transformation?
Yeah, I think so. It's worth saying because I didn't get to it in case anyone's like, higher endeavor, and what are you talking about? What do
Oh,
you fund? In general, leading toward those more equitable outcomes that we talked about for our focus student populations, what we're funding to get to that end is we are funding catalytic efforts on campuses across 200 plus campuses across the country that are kind of catalytic to their transformation efforts. So the concept that institutions can transform and change to better meet the needs of really focused student populations, but all their students simultaneously, right? And so we truly believe that it's possible. We also believe that the institution can serve as a catalytic to student success or as a barrier to student success. And we're very clear about that too. It's not about a student being the change agent and the student is kind of the cause of any equity gap and things like that. We really see the institution as playing a significant role in admitting students and then ensuring and taking responsibility for the graduation, persistence, and success of those students. And we work with intermediaries to do that. So we fund 6 intermediaries. We call them intermediaries for scale, of which CCA is one, to really work side by side in trusted partnership with these 200 plus institutions in their transformational effort. It's a multi-year effort, and we're really excited about it. We're really excited to work with CCA and the rest of the intermediaries for scale. So I just wanted to name that's what we're actually
I
doing
appreciate that.
to get to the outcomes that we're talking about. I'm going to speak maybe to some more of them in some examples coming up. But you mentioned the equity mindedness. I think there are ways both tangibly and to some extent a little bit more intangibly that equity-mindedness comes into play, both in our funding, our strategy, but also in the work of the intermediaries and the institutions that we mentioned. The most tangible ways, quite frankly, an example of one would be something like use of disaggregated data that I mentioned, right? And so how are you being really clear around how equity in outcomes is looking at your given institution or set of institutions? And so it's really about looking very honestly at factual data that's in front of us and how that data is showcasing the inequities and the outcomes that those inequities are producing. I think there's also something to be said around equity mindedness in intent and in outcome. So, what I mean by equity mindedness intent, I think a lot about the design of programs, policies, structures, et cetera, that are intended to drive student success. Are those things even designed from the start with, for example, student voice and specifically student voice of our focused student populations that's informing from the beginning what those programs, policies, structures, et cetera, look like?
I'm
I
gonna
think there
say
is a
amen.
So I think, we talk, you hear a lot in the higher ed field of knowledge that many of the institutions in this country were not founded
Mhm.
with our focused student populations in mind. That can be known, but we're also talking about institutions in front of us today. So what does that mean
Yeah.
when institutions that may have been founded a significant amount of time ago still might not be manifesting the structures, the policies, the culture that is responsive to the student population of today and not some abstract, those are those students, the students that are on your campus. I have yet to meet an institution that says like, I don't want to serve those students. Like they accept those students, they want them to do well,
Yeah.
for many of reasons. But I think we hope, and I think we see with the institutions in this effort in particular, institutions that want to hold students at the center of all of the competing priorities that, quite frankly, are very real for institutions. And so, for us, part of that equity mindedness is holding the student at the center, even with the reality that there's a lot of other stakeholders and realities that are tugging at the attention, time, energy, and resources of institutions out there. In, I think in terms of the commitment to impact, and this kind of maybe goes to the learning orientation that we strive to achieve, not just as a foundation, but I think a lot of the partners that we fund also have a very similar commitment to cycles of continuous improvement, continuously learning, continuously to improve, right? Is how do we continually reflect on our equity orientation? So I would say that because of the world we live in, an equity orientation may at sometimes be countercultural. So there are times where the pace, the structure, the policies that exist in our very organizations and institutions are not necessarily conducive to equity mindedness. And so it actually takes very intentional time and energy to either slow down the pace, to have some reflective practice that says, wait a minute, to that point earlier about our pivotal moment, if we hadn't stopped and we had just stopped at like success, completion, we're winning, we could have just kept going. And we would have continued to see that degree of success, but we would have missed out on a whole additional new degree of success when it comes to prioritizing the closure of equity gaps. And so for us, I think it is also that equity mindedness is being countercultural in those ways, creating space and time where it may not exist, and also reminding ourselves as a foundation, as a team, that that is the work. That
Mhm.
if we didn't take time and energy to center that reflective practice, we would miss a lot of things. And I think it's very challenging given, and I say pace a lot, but I think anyone who's probably listening to this, working at an institution, working at an organization, understands that the list of things to do in a given day is significantly longer than the workday hours allotted. And again, depending on your orientation towards equity, that may be by structure, right? And so we need to combat that as much as possible. Um, the last thing I'll say around this has been what has been most helpful in prioritizing and acting on equity mindedness is being in community with others who are also prioritizing the same. So when you are surrounding yourself with other organizations, other institutions who are prioritizing the same, it's not countercultural. It is the norm in a given group of institutions or group of organizations. That becomes very powerful. And I think it's kind of like the wildfire fire of scaling this work, right? Where
Mhm.
no individual organization or institution is out there alone saying, I'm the only one trying to do this. It's so hard. They're finding their peers, they're finding other institutions who are in this together and can talk about how challenging it is and how much success they are hopefully finding along the way. As they share best practices and other things. So I hope I got to some of that equity mindedness in
Yeah.
those responses.
Definitely, like two things stick out to me. One is that um, everything you speak to validates the commitment to the mission
Hmm.
that you said is on the wall, right? When
Yep.
you walk into the campus,
Yep.
and how important it is to have your organization aligned with your values and your practices aligned with your organizational mission. Like, so
Yeah.
that stuck out to me because that becomes your the thing that always brings you back to, okay, is it just success? Or have we looked at this part, right?
Yeah.
And then the other part is the importance of having a village.
Hmm.
Communities of color always talk about the village and how you
Yep.
need a village to do this work, to raise a child, to do it, move your
Hmm.
community. And so, what I think has happened, quite honestly, in the high endeavor is like the building of a village
Hmm.
of individuals, professionals of all different backgrounds and positionalities who are saying, okay, I'm committed to this work and let's figure out a way, which
Yep.
is has been, I think, truly remarkable because the network has become so big
Hmm.
that you can find people with all different types of experiences that you didn't
Yep.
even know. Like I would never have known that about you, until you like start chatting a little bit. I
Yeah.
think it's great. When you think about the shifting institutional culture that we're seeing, we are definitely talking about the long game. So we know higher ed is all about it takes it's impossible sometimes to move that ship, right?
Yep.
So how do you balance like immediate needs with the long-term vision of creating inclusive and supporting learning environments? Like what does that process really look like for practice in practice?
That's a big and complex question, and so I'll
I
get to
know.
maybe a piece of it. So two things I will say is I feel really grateful as a leader and a peer in this work where we're talking about a 5 year, so a multi-year, multi-million dollar funded effort, which in philanthropy is not always the case. Maybe a year here, 2 years here. Um, we have some time, a bit of a timescape, and in part because we know how long institutional change
Yeah.
takes. And we're looking at KPIs, quite frankly, that we're hoping to move the needle on that require a significant amount of time from change to outcome, right? And so there's a couple ways. So one, and I really appreciate the Gates Foundation like prides himself on this. We are very clear on our North Stars. So we might talk about stuff that's important today, this month, this year, but every day we're thinking, what is our end goal from um, a metric perspective, right? So every day I'm thinking at the end of the day, everything that I'm doing or funding should contribute in some way to KPI change for student outcomes. And I'm thinking about first year course completion ratio. I'm thinking about first year completion. I'm thinking about overall graduation and completion. And so for us, we maintain a view of the long game, even if we're in year one, day one of a 5 year plus work, right? And so that's very important for us to center the data and our goals in that way. But I do think, and it's also specific to this creating an inclusive and supportive learning environment, is uh, the Gates Foundation and Strategic Philanthropy has very clear ideas of the way we think transformation could come about and some of the key components that are necessary. And that's from our previous investments, right? We learn, we apply to the next, we learn, we apply to the next. This is the scaling component of our work, which means like we've taken everything we've learned about institutional transformation and we've prioritized those components. So we look at institutional needs assessments that look at the institution across multiple sectors, not just an individual division or individual department. We're looking at continuous cycles of improvement. So not just saying, I'm going to do this one thing and then 5 years later we'll come back and we'll see if it went well. Um, we are implementing things that we see are, and our partners are implementing these things in the field that we think are important. And I'm not going to say but, I'm going to say and we try our best to allow for significant flexibility and contextualization to both the institutional reality and to the reality of the field at a given time, right? So the field, there's people talk about higher education and institutions of higher education being notoriously slow. Um, that may or may not be true, depending on the institution. But what is also true is that the pace of change, in terms of our student populations, is not slow. So you like blink your eye, and like there's a new social media platform, there's a new profession that we are trying to prepare students for. When I was in the campus in student affairs, they used to joke about every year I come back and I'm a year older, but the students stay the same age. I think that also is changing a little bit now, right? As we think
Yeah.
about what is a traditional student on a campus, I think we see a broader range of students, but that degree of change is very real. And I think for a strategic philanthropy that has an idea of what success could be, we will have to pivot. Our partners will be pivoting in the field and saying that was a great idea. Like that was developed by experts. We may have even give input on our institution said they needed that. And now things have changed.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the orientation towards inclusive and supportive environments really comes into play. Because if we were to dig our heels in and say, but no, that like made sense and that we're pretty sure it's going to keep making sense, just keep trying. Um, that would not be a very supportive environment for an institution who
Mhm.
is really trying to manifest their hope and aspiration of better supporting their students, for the organizations and intermediaries such as CCA who are very clear on their mission and what they're trying to accomplish. Um, and even for a foundation, our outcomes, we wouldn't be achieving our outcomes, right, if we weren't being responsive to the context. So that's one way. I think the last thing I would say, though, around specifically creating inclusive and supportive learning environments, I think there's something to be said for that's what we want for our students. I think there's something to be said about trying to do that for ourselves as professionals, whether at the institution, in the organizations, or divide those who design strategy that are meant to address. If we can't create or try to create supportive, equitable, inclusive environments in our day to day, I do sometimes question what we're able to advocate for on behalf of our students. And so it speaks more to the how we go about this work, maybe even, maybe not more so, but at least side by side of the what we're encouraging or investing in organizations doing. So I think that part, while it feels sometimes less tangible. Maybe even some people would see it as kind of fluffy, like the people work. It's actually one of the most exciting components of the investment in intermediaries for scale and transformation at scale, higher endeavor community, because I don't think I would be wrong if I would say that the organizations represented, perhaps even the institutions represented, would agree with that sentiment of like, no, it's not just important for this, it's important for us to model and
Oh,
to know what
definitely.
that feels like along the way. So, um, again, easier said than done. I do think it is countercultural at times to do that in practice.
But I think you're so right. I have three young adults of my own, my little people who are no longer little. And it's a different student now
Hmm.
because they will challenge and say, well, how are you asking me to
Yep.
do this? Or how are you doing this, but you don't do this yourself?
Yep.
Or your organization doesn't do this, or the administration doesn't do this. And so before, when I was in college, if the administration said it, I mean, I was a little militant, but for the most part, if they said that this is what we did, by and large, mostly you did it. And now students are saying, no,
Yeah.
you can't tell us to do one thing, but we watch you do something else. It
Hmm.
doesn't work. And so I think there's a whole different level of accountability,
Yeah.
which at first seems a little offensive if you are the senior person, right? Like, who are you to tell me what to do? But then, I mean, I'm appreciative of it because it
Yeah.
makes us really walk the talk, right? And it makes us to really have to reflect and, like, as you said, like take the time
Yep.
to say, how can we ask them to do this? How
Yep.
can we say we're creating this space for them when they see how we treat each other or they
Yep.
see how we go through this process, right?
I want to pick up on one point you said because I think about it often, and maybe this is an opinion piece. So I'll say this is my opinion based on my experience, is I feel like it's hardest sometimes to hear and understand that student reality that may be very different than our own,
Mhm.
especially as folks have built deep expertise, right? I work side by side folks who have PhDs in institutional transformation,
Right.
like folks who have been doing this work their entire life. Myself, I joke I'm one-dimensional. I've only ever worked in higher ed, student success, predominantly for Black and brown students. That's all I've ever done.
Yeah.
And to be able to step out of ego, to sometimes step out of everything that you might have been taught or learned, or even experienced, and say, this is also a reality. This actually may be a reality that is of greater magnitude at this point in time, and we need to better position ourselves for that. It is very challenging. I think I am in a lot of conversations, and it doesn't mean that someone's necessarily wrong, because all those other things that are learned and experienced may also be very true. And to your point, there are just new realities that I think many of us never even thought could have never even imagined
Right.
as a reality for students today. And so just a shout out to all the experts out there that are like learning something new today. It's okay. Like, or finding themselves being like, man, maybe this ain't as true as it used to be. That's also okay. And so sending love out to that group of folks.
It's a whole new world, right? You thought you were done learning in
Exactly.
some regard, but it's like,
Never.
nah, there's a new
Never.
thing.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
let's talk a little bit about like stories of impact, right? And so equity work, like often you get some good stories around what stands out to you? Like, could you share a story that stands out where the foundation like support made a tangible difference in advancing equity, or some particular initiative or anything that you're like, okay, this is when we really got it right.
Yeah, storytelling ain't my best, Nia. If you were like, show me the data, I would come here and show you an Excel sheet and I'd be like, done.
But what
But
about
there's
something that touched your heart? What about that?
oh my gosh. Even harder, even harder. But I'll do a couple things that I hear consistently that makes me think that we're making an impact. And then a couple examples that I won't say I'll say indirectly. I'll give the kudos to partners in our ecosystem for actualizing some of the individual stories I've heard. So in general, I think one of the things that I appreciate with the investments coming out of the post-secondary success team is I consistently hear both from grantees, so organizations, nonprofits, researchers, things like it, just lots of entities that we fund, is a deep appreciation for one, the scaling component of our work. So folks who have been doing great things and have been like, but I've been so limited in how many people I've been able to bring this to. And to say thank you for giving us the opportunity to just like amplify this good work to more institutions, to more students. And so that's one thing that I think the foundation, not just in this scaling effort, but in many of our efforts, which are about kind of the ripple effect of doing more better with more and more institutions for more and more students. That is something that I think is uniquely exciting to work on the post-secondary success team at the foundation, and I hear that a lot. From the institution side, I think what I often hear is similar deep appreciation for providing support. And sometimes it's monetary, but usually it's in the form of, for example, funding the intermediaries that work most directly with them, creating space and time to actualize something that they've intended to do for quite some time. So we've really wanted to sit down and look at our data across the campus and prioritize what's the best first step, second step, third step in our transformation journey. We haven't had the time and space. We haven't had the expert support. We haven't had the facilitation that's going to stay with us and know us as an institution, not just someone who's going to come in, facilitate a meeting, and then never show up again. We fund intermediaries, and I've said this in other spaces, that have deep intentional and effective relationships with institutions over the course of time. And so our intermediaries are not just, or the intermediaries are not just here for this funded effort. They have existed in many cases in relation with institutions way before us, and they will continue to exist in relationship with institutions far beyond this specific effort. And I think that's a good thing. It's why we selected the intermediaries that we did. But there's so many institutions who have such a desire to do certain things and they don't have the resources. And I mean that broadly, whether it be time, money, support, expertise, technical assistance. So that's another thing that I think the foundation has been uniquely positioned to do and bring. in terms of maybe the one or two like stories that get to the heart, I think you're talking about. The reason I say I do it like tangentially and more around partner impact more so than foundation impact, because it actually speaks to things that go beyond maybe I wouldn't say the boundaries, but beyond the formalized intent of some of our investments. And it speaks more to our partners and our institution's ability to most deeply understand student experience. And so there have been a number of experiences where students have either been brought to talk to the foundation or we've facilitated students kind of voice being brought to the institutions themselves when it comes to decision making and strategy development, where things were showcased that weren't known before. And I'm thinking of a panel we had at the foundation with students who came, and we had a student who was talking about being in some geometric, like where they like look at satellites and they figure out how to like farm space for crops or something. It was very complex. I did not understand. It was a very smart student. And they basically got their degree in this thing. And they were so excited about it. Like the way they talked about it was amazing. And it was a showcase of excellence because the student had just graduated. So, it was like very exciting. We're going to dinner with this student later, and it came to pass that in order to enter into the profession that this student wanted to enter in and doing this geolocating thing with crops and all this kind of stuff, um, a lot of it was government work. And the student disclosed that they were an undocumented student. And they didn't realize that they're actually not able to qualify for the majority of jobs that they had trained and like developed such a rich skill set around doing. And it felt like everybody's heart was just like, what? Like, you have the expertise. You're so excited about this. And there's like such an opportunity gap now. Like, it was going to be that much harder for that student. And that student hadn't disclosed to anybody on their campus, not an advisor, not an instructor, not anyone that they felt trusting enough in relationship to have that conversation. And I think I mean, we're really into advising. We're really into the power of relationships between faculty and students. Um, because that institution may never know the full reality of that student experience that's actually going to be highly relevant, not just to employability, which is something that is important and may be tracked, but also to the life that that student aspires to live in that profession and contributing in the way that we saw or in contributing in the way that they saw. And so for me, it just felt like, man, so many wins. And yet there's more work to be done. To ensure that that student has either continued support, more nuanced guidance, the relationships that can help them realize some of those things earlier in the game, right? Then as they walk across that stage and start to apply to stuff. In addition to a lot of other things we could advocate for based on that story, but at least for the
I
stuff as
know,
it
'cause
relates to
it's
institutions.
heartbreaking because I think you think about all the missed opportunities. Like
Hmm.
there are probably people on campus who maybe
Hmm.
could have helped them navigate
Hmm.
um, their status and just all kinds of things. But I think it also speaks to students' sense of belonging, right? So when we do our campus visits, we always ask the question to tell us about somebody who made you feel like you mattered
Hmm.
while you were in. And so it's a very interesting dialogue because people will
Yep.
pull out people, and then on every campus, there's usually somebody who says no one.
Yeah.
And and so you think, okay, so this person had no one. And so they say, well, that's why I do this,
Hmm.
because I didn't want another student to have no one. So, I think that all of this work also helps to remind us that for someone on campus, you
Yep.
may be the one.
Yep.
And how do you keep that so what do you live up to? Like how do
Yep.
you fulfill that responsibility and that mission, right? Oh, that breaks my heart.
No, no, it's there's a lot out there like that, right? So I just a lot of stories where it's like, oh, again, well intended, right?
Yeah.
And in so many ways, that institution did the thing. Like that student graduated. That
Yeah.
student was excited about what they studied. They did well in their studies.
Yeah.
And yet there's more to the story. And so I think it's why I appreciate the student voice component of our work.
Yeah.
Because so many things are not known when kind of nerds like me are just looking at the Excels, right? Just looking at certain rates of success and looking at the statistical likelihood of things. So much gets missed. And so I appreciate the contextualization that our partners do, that our institutions do, that I think just makes them that much stronger.
Yeah. I totally agree. I totally agree. Um So as we've been talking about, this is complex work, right?
Yes.
And we often reach challenges like the one that you just talked about. Do you have like hurdles that have been like some of your biggest hurdles that you've had to face or the foundation and how have you successfully navigated them or managed them?
Yeah. Um, no challenges. Every
No
day is
challenges,
just
it's easy
sunshine
peasy.
and rainbows.
I need to come over there.
This, um, there's some ways in which there's probably an answer to this that can be very generalizable that everyone was like, yes, I experience that every day. And there's some specific to being a foundation,
Mhm.
or some that are specific to the very intentional type of institutional transformation that we hope to spur. I think because the question is around funding equity and racial justice related work, there's a couple things that come to mind, and I don't think they'll be super new. So one is that it's very hard, I might argue impossible, to depersonalize this work. There are very few professionals, if any, in the ecosystem that we fund, or even at the team that I work with, that don't have a very personal reason for doing what they do every day. And whether it be specific to their higher education experience or the experience of someone who is very near and dear to them, um, there are very real reasons. And so that means when you say challenges and barriers, you're not just talking about work things that go
Yeah.
away at 5 o'clock or whatever time you might, midnight for you, whatever time you might end your day. um there are barriers and challenges that your body holds like because you're like even the example of that story you're like that breaks my heart that you hold that with you in your day to day. I've never had a job that's not like that, right? But they do exist, right? There are jobs where you just go there at 9,
Where?
you leave at
Where?
5. I don't know, Neil, we hang out with the wrong crowd, but I think that makes the work extra hard at times. It also what makes it extra valuable at times. Like there are joys and purpose that I can get, and many of the folks we fund can get out of their work that are not possible when there is not that personal connection. Um, but I had a colleague that once talked about sometimes when the barriers and the challenges start to mount, it becomes kind of it's just about it's a quantity issue and it can be overwhelming. And I think we use the word burnout a lot, but burnout insinuates that there's like an out, like you've burned out. I think there's just a lot of consistent overwhelm that I see in the field, um, that I think cuts into professional abilities. If I'm thinking about something and one of these challenges deeply and personally all day, it's going to make my responsibilities as assigned harder to accomplish. That's just the way it's going to be. Um, and you just add to it, you think about the student experience who are also probably holding on to those things. And then you get motivated again. You're like, hey, if they could deal with this, I could deal with that. We're all in this together. Um, but that is for me at least, and for what I see from folks, is one of the most like impactful complexities that quite frankly I don't hear talked about enough. I go to some self-care sessions every now and then. I talk to some senior leaders that are like, yeah, it's hard out here. And then they just go do their job. And I'm like, man, when are we um ensuring that we're is sustaining ourselves in this work? So that is one reality, I would say. The other one, I've kind of alluded to it earlier, is I I think I might have mentioned this on a panel I was on at CCA not too long ago, around when I was very early on in my profession in student affairs, maybe even when I was still in my grad program, someone was like, Gabriela, like not every institution is student centered. And I was like, I don't actually believe that. And quite frankly, I don't believe that now. Um, but I think I've understood more with nuance what they meant, and that is that the number of competing priorities that institutional leaders in particular are dealing with are many. When I think about the fiscal responsibilities of institutions, when I think about the complexity of the political realities that institutions are dealing with, when I think about the histories that students carry with them, or not students, that institutions carry with them. Some of those histories are actually conducive and contribute to the positive student experience, and some are barriers and service challenges. And that's why transformation is, at the cornerstone of what we're doing. They need to be uh, changed if they're to better address the student needs of today. And so for me, I think it's it's hard to keep students at the center. And I don't want to say that as like giving institutions or leaders a pass, but I think it is hard for them. Like they're like, no, we want to hold the students at the center. And I got all these things on my list in order to be able to do that. I got to keep the doors open in order to revamp my advising system. I got to keep the doors open to ensure that we're providing quality high, education for a diverse population of students. And so I don't necessarily envy the institutional leaders today, but I hold a lot of respect and grace for the realities that they are facing. And I don't think there's one right answer, right? So that's where I think like the contextualization and the flexibility comes into play because I agree in best practice sharing. I agree in not reinventing the wheel in terms of institutional transformation and practice change. And I also believe in the relevance of leadership because institutional leaders are weighing a lot and they're taking as many inputs as they can in a very, very challenging circumstance for a lot of different reasons. I just mentioned a few. So I know I spoke a little bit more high level, but I do think those things are always at the root, quite frankly, of some of the conversations we might have where we're looking for a yes and no answer to why or why not an institution would want to do something or not, when really it's always going to be like yes and no and here's all the nuance context underneath it. And I appreciate that a lot of institutions are open to being in discussion with that. Like maybe they're saying no, and here's a long list of stuff, and a supportive intermediary or other peer might be saying, you know what, actually, we had that list too, and here's how we started to go in that direction anyways. Or like, you know what, actually, I can help you with these two things. And I know this other institution that can help you with those two things. And once we get us together, you've addressed them, you're ready to go to yes. You're on your catalytic journey towards transformation. I think that's what we hope and aspire is happening with the peer-to-peer learning in particular with institutions in our network, um, especially in trusting spaces. And so I think that's also relevant, again, in the context of how institutions are presented to the field, to students, to families, to communities. Um, it's I don't want to say branding because that is like not sufficient enough word. Um, but again, another stakeholder, another piece of context that's relevant. I hope
Yeah,
that's okay in an answer.
yeah. I think that we found that that's one of the things that institutions have valued the most
Hmm.
is meeting people, like instance people on campuses meeting other individuals on similar campuses
Yep,
that have the same role, that have
yep,
the same experience, that are struggling with the same things, so that they can get
yep,
together and talk about it. And what you talk about, like with trust and vulnerability, that's something that we work really hard on,
yep.
just helping them to understand that we are like, we win if you win.
Hmm.
Right. And so we have to know what you're really struggling with in order to be able to help you create the conditions
Yep.
that will support that. But it's in an environment where everything is so competitive all the time
Hmm.
and things and sometimes it seems like people are just taking notes to figure out when you'll fail. It's a challenge, right? And I think that the more we work together in the way that we've set up that this project has been set up,
Yep.
I think it gives people um inkling or insight into how it could be different.
Yep.
Because Yolanda Watson Spiva, who's our president, she always says there are enough students out there for everyone. And so we
Yep.
don't really have to fight over students because we have enough of them. It's really just trying to figure out how do you create the environment that's supported for the group of students who belong where you are, right?
Yep.
And so I think just keeping, that in mind is what we need to do. And we're almost out of time, but what I wanted to ask you, I know, what I wanted to ask you is what brings you joy in this world? We've talked a little bit about this. I know it's a surprise question,
That
but
question was not on the
and it
list.
was not on the list. Okay, so let's talk. So because I'm thinking about like, yo, you all have accomplished like amazing things with this project,
Mhm.
and I hope at some point you sit back and say, okay, like we are doing good work. Yes, we have lots of work to do, but we're doing good work. And so, is there something about it, or
Mhm.
you can say when you visit CCA, that's fine. But
That is true. That is true.
so
Um, okay, Joy. Um, uh, w- we have funded great things. Y'all have accomplished great things. So I just want to distinguish between like we are funders, and I am very proud of the funding we have done. But the organizations, the institutions, the entities that we fund are out there doing the work. They're taking what was a strategy on paper, a learning that has manifested, as to do these things seem to be the things that work well. Let's test it, let's prove it, let's scale it. Um, that work is hard. I think the organizations in this higher endeavor community, part of the transformation at scales kind of work, I think it's the balance of the head and the heart that I see in the professionals I work with because I could nerd out around data and measurements and progress, and we did X% better and all of that, and that's important. I don't think I wouldn't be working at the foundation if I didn't think those things were important because of our data orientation. And there's something about the combination of that orientation and that precision of intent with the empathy and the sympathy and the understanding of the broader context of what we're trying to do. Right. I'm talking about students, and I think people might think we're talking about like the academic beings. um, yes, and no
Mhm.
one is just an academic being. Students
Right.
aren't just students, right? They are siblings, they are parents, they are brothers, sisters, all of that stuff. Um, and I don't think I would have to I am reminded of that in every conversation that I have with grantees, with the institutions that are part of this effort. That recognition, I don't need to convince anybody of that. That is a shared understanding that we're in this for the student at large, not the academic component of or even the employability, things that are again important metrics, but it's about this student's holistic lived experience. I want them to graduate this institution because of us instead of in spite of us,
Mhm.
right? I think that's a belief that institutions in this network hold. And I think they're trying every day to figure out how to make that come to pass. And I've learned so much in even just the short number of years that I've been proximate to the stories, proximate to the progress around what progress means. Because I could talk about student KPIs all day, and I have consistently learned way more around broadening the definition of success to be more inclusive of those holistic student realities than just the academic component, which I don't want to minimize it because it is important. Um, but I think we'd be better off, like as a society, if we looked at people as full human beings more consistently. And so to see that be the case with the institutions and the organizations we work with in this effort, um, that brings me joy. That's a good reminder on the day to day when maybe I feel like that's not the case more holistically out in the world, that we're trying to center human beings at the center of what we work. They just happen to be students.
I think that's a great way to end.
Hey.
Um, this has been a great conversation for me because I think you've provided a wonderful overview of how the strategy came to be and how it reminded us of why we do this work. And that it's going to be challenging because I tell my kids all the time, if nothing worth having is easy. And so we have to do a little bit of work, right? But it was a really good conversation to kind of refocus us on, remind us on why we do this and that
Mhm.
we're in this together. And there really is a village in higher endeavor to get this
Yes.
work done. So thank you very much for being our first guest.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
That was our guest, Gabriela Torres, Deputy Director, Transformation at Scale on the Postsecondary Success Team at the Gates Foundation. We'd like to thank her for sharing her expertise with us, and thank you at home for tuning in. Be sure to catch future episodes of the Voices for Justice podcast as we continue to highlight powerful stories and important discussions around equity and justice. I'm Alyssa Silva, and we'll see you next time.